Hey pals, welcome back. So a couple of months ago I shared my living room setup, and one of the things that seemed to really upset people was where I had placed my PlayStation 5. Now, it's not completely my fault. The PS5 is enormous, so finding a sensible place for it was always going to be a bit of a struggle. Personally, I don't think having your gaming console on the floor is necessarily a bad thing. As long as there's decent clearance for the intake and exhaust fans, you shouldn't really have any issues with airflow. And I'm also not that worried about dust either. As you can see, I've replaced the original side panels with these dark plates from Dbrand, which have detachable mesh filters on both sides to help prevent any buildup. That being said, I did toy with the idea of changing out my media unit for something that would make the PS5 feel a bit more integrated. But I had a hard time finding anything that was both affordable and fit with my existing furniture while also having a tall enough shelf to contain the gargantuan PS5. If I'm being honest though, I prefer just to get it out of sight completely. I know looks are subjective, but personally I don't think it's a very good looking console, and I've never really been happy with how it looked in my setup, so I started to look into other options. At first I considered wall mounting it behind the TV, but this would have meant replacing my TV bracket for something with a bit more articulation and would have affected the LED lighting, which also isn't ideal. Hiding it inside my IKEA Bestie unit obviously wasn't an option either, due to the restricted airflow. But then I came across these cabinet fans, and it got me wondering, could I build an air-cooled media unit? Here's how it went. So I did a bit of research online and eventually settled on this dual fan system, which is made by a company called AC Infinity. Not only does it come in white, which means it would match the colour of my media unit, but it also has a control panel that allows you to set thermal triggers to manage the fan speed automatically. Inside the box you'll find the fans themselves, a thermal probe to measure ambient temperature, the user manual and some other literature, a couple of fixings, and finally the control panel. One thing to note is that it comes included with a US plug, so if you're based outside of North America, you'll either need to get an adapter or a compatible power cable with equivalent voltage. I'd recommend doing a quick test to make sure that everything works before you start cutting into your furniture. One of the things I had to consider was the fan positioning. If you're using the horizontal stand that comes with the PS5, the warm air will be expelled from the left-hand side as you're looking straight at it. This means that the optimal position for the exhaust fan would be on the upper left side of the unit, with the intake being underneath the PS5 to allow cool air to efficiently flow through the cabinet. I decided to take the media unit off the wall to give me a bit more room to maneuver everything and also to check that the wall fittings were still secure. I probably should have asked for help with this, but I'm too impatient and I ended up doing it all on my own, like an idiot. After emptying all the stuff I had stored inside and moving my tech to a safe location, I got to work on removing the media unit from the wall. I found a couple of plant pots and propped them up underneath with some towels before unscrewing the fittings and setting it down gently. I figured I'd start with the intake fan, which would be out of sight if anything were to go wrong. I used a pencil to draw a cutout for the fans, using the plastic stencil that was also included in the box. I decided to use a multi-tool rather than a saw, which made this much easier, especially since I flipped the unit upside down, so I was able to approach this from above. Cutting out this first hole was a breeze, and the intake fit perfectly. I screwed it in using the included fixings, which were also painted white, which I thought was a nice touch, before taking a step back to admire my handiwork. This got me feeling a little bit too confident, so I then rotated the media unit right side up to attack the exhaust fan. In doing so, I accidentally scratched one of the doors, which was super annoying and definitely took me down a peg. Approaching the exhaust fan from the side resulted in me losing any precision I had with the multi-tool. It was so much harder to gauge where to place the bit, and this step was much scrappier than I'd like to admit. If I was going to do this project again, I would probably install the fans before assembling the unit to give myself a bit more flexibility. It was a bit of a hack job, but I eventually got the exhaust fan in place, and I began with installing the control panel. The original plan was to have it to the right of the exhaust fan, but I realised I had just enough clearance to install it underneath the shelf inside, which meant it would do a better job of hiding the cables from view. Once again, I found it really difficult to make accurate cuts, but after a bit of trial and error, I managed to get the job done with minimal collateral damage. I wired everything up and did another quick test to make sure that the fans were definitely working, before realising that my next step was to put the media unit back on the wall. Let me tell you, when I say that this was a ball ache, I can't stress how much of an understatement that is. I whipped out my trusty flower pots, loaded up the media unit, and then realised that the screws weren't going to reach the holes. It took me a good amount of tinkering and a little bit of soul searching, but eventually I managed to get them to line up. After manhandling the media unit for an hour, I was pretty knackered, but I pushed through and wired up the PS5 before reinstalling my sound system. At this point, I began to realise how much better my setup looked without the PlayStation on show. Everything looked a bit more balanced, and the subwoofer felt much more at home in the corner of the room. The contrast of white on wood looks really nice too. More importantly, I set a temperature of 21 degrees using the control panel and booted everything up to see what would happen. It didn't take long for the fans to kick in, and from there I was able to maintain a consistent temperature. I noticed that the fans were quite loud, so I set a higher temperature to see if I could get them to turn on only when they absolutely had to. After a bit of experimenting, I found that the default mode would restrict the media unit from going over a set temperature, but it wouldn't really cool things down. So it would sort of bounce within a degree or two and would continuously activate the fans, which got a bit annoying. I read through the user manual and learned that the smart mode was a bit more dynamic and gradually increased fan speed the closer to the thermal trigger that the probe measured. This worked perfectly, and the fans managed to keep the media unit at a sensible temperature. Even better, at lower speeds they're really quiet and basically inaudible over the noise of the TV. I played a variety of different games to see if I could heat things up a bit and get the fans to ramp up again. Surprisingly, I found that having the fans at their lowest speed was sufficient enough to prevent the ambient temperature from getting high enough for this, and the PS5 fans didn't turn on at all. I fiddled around with the temperature settings and eventually settled on a thermal trigger of 28 degrees Celsius. This means that the cabinet would need to get noticeably warmer than room temperature before the fans kick in, and so far this seems to work really well. Obviously it's still winter, so ambient temperature is slightly lower than normal, and I'm curious to see how much of an impact the fan system has during the warmer months of the year. I tested a few different games, including Hogwarts Legacy, God of War and Gran Turismo, to see if there was anything that would have a noticeable impact on the temperature. No matter what I did, the AC Infinity system stopped the temperature from ever going over 25 degrees, which was the point at which the lowest fan speed would kick in. So all in all, I would say that this DIY project turned out to be a big success. Apart from a few errors with the multi-tool and some minor scratches, everything worked out as well as I could hope, and I'm really happy with the end result. I'd like to add some pass-through holes to the shelf that the PS5 sits on at some point to allow air to travel more freely through the unit, but that's a job for another day. Hopefully this inspires some of you to find creative ways to make your TV setups look their best. But seriously, get someone to help with the heavy lifting. If you enjoyed this video, you should definitely check out my recent workspace upgrade, where we gave my friend's home office a complete overhaul, which looked so good. Otherwise, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.